Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM. I've got a really interesting interview for you tonight with Josh Colle, who is a Senior Vice President with Ernst & Young in their infrastructure area. As you probably remember, he was a city councillor and he was the chairman of the Toronto Transit Commission. And he recently wrote a really interesting article on the future of transit. And so I wanted to talk to him a little bit tonight about transit and what he thinks about the future. Josh, welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour.
Brian, good to see you. Glad to be here. Thanks for the conversation.
So, what's the thesis of your opinion? You think that transit use is going to go down?
I think the thesis is, well, let's put it this way. I'm working with a lot of municipalities and transit agencies, and as we all know and can see in our newspaper headlines, ridership is down considerably. And that means revenue is lower for all of these municipalities.
The article that I read said the TTC said their revenue was down 80%.
Yeah, and that's pretty common across North America, maybe even higher. Like I was just talking to someone in New York, and it's even higher there. So obviously a time of reflection, and as we look at kind of how the world may be changing, I know an overused phrase these days, but what will transit look like when we start to slowly reemerge? And I think the broad thesis is that it's going to look different in the way we operate transit, but maybe even also the way we build transit. And so it's anyone's kind of best projection when that ridership comes back, but clearly there will be different standards by which operations are delivered, and my guess is on how transit's built, because a cram bus has a very different kind of set of implications now than it did just a few weeks or months ago.
So do you think this is going to be a short-term impact, just as we're sort of coming back before a vaccine is on the market, or is this going to be a long-term change?
So both. I think short term is financial, right? Like short term, there's some serious impacts, and just how do transit agencies, replenish their coffers, because so much of all of their revenues either from the fare box or from a municipal subsidy, and both those kind of sources of revenue are under strain. But as the economy starts to reopen, and we're starting to see signs of that here in Ontario and in other places, it's quite clear there'll be an expectation for transit to operate, right? To move people around, to kickstart the economy, to keep getting essential service workers around and more. How do you bridge that gap if you're still, say, providing 100% of your service or 90%, but you're only at ridership for 50 or 60%?
So one of the things that people have done so far, transit, is lowered service, which frankly complicates the problem of social distancing, or physically distancing at least, even more, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And so imagine when we would start going back to work in some shape or form, we'll have to then ramp up that service, right? Because most transit agencies have long held crowding standards, right? How many people is it reasonable to be on a bus or on a subway train? Those standards will all have to be reviewed. And so if the implication now is, say, you're able to put 50 people on a bus before, and now you're only comfortable with 25, well, that means you have to run a lot more buses, and that means a lot more money and cost. So governments are going to have to really quickly turn their mind to how do you deliver service in that new environment, and you have to assume that's going to last for a while. I just think it's still in the big picture short term, but we're talking about months for sure, not just weeks.
So, do we have the capacity to, effectively double supply?
Yeah, and that's the issue, right? And so I think we have the capacity, because I don't think ridership will return that quickly. I think in surveys you see, and I just saw some data today, polling data, where kind of trying to measure people's comfort with doing things that we typically took for granted. And you can see a large number of Canadians won't be comfortable immediately returning to malls, to retail shopping, to restaurants, and certainly public transit. being in that list. And so I think people are waiting for certain steps to be taken, sanitation and hygiene and better standards, which is, I'm sure, all being developed. I know it is by transit agencies. But for those who are waiting for vaccine or treatments, that's going to be a while. And so my expectation is that they'll have capacity in this period, because they were built for, if you think of in Mississauga or Toronto, built for moving so many people, and if they're only back to 75%, they'll be able to move them, but now your cost per passenger or your daily costs are that much more because you're not generating the revenue you were before.
So, I live in Mississauga. I work downtown Toronto. I take a GO train from Clarkson. And anytime between 7 and 9 o'clock, I'm standing, particularly if it's on the express.
Yeah.
And I'm within half an inch of the person next to me. Frankly, even if we go down by 25 or 50%, you're certainly not 6 feet away from anybody.
Yeah, exactly. And so not only what is the implication of that on the service we're currently operating, like your GO train trip, but how does that impact the way we might build the Ontario line or a crosstown extension or a BRT or LRT in Mississauga, right? And so I think part of the challenge now is to look at not only operating kind of standards you have now in say in Mississauga, but what standard will you now build bus and LRT platforms or stations that are planned and funded in most cases? I think that what I'm suggesting is that there's going to have to be a new lens applied to the way you deliver transit and how you build it. And that is a really valuable public policy lens, being health and safety, but not one that has typically been at the top of that list previously.
We're speaking tonight with Josh Colle, former city councillor, former chair of the TTC, and currently a senior vice president of infrastructure with Ernst & Young. We're going to take a break for messages and come right back. Just stay with us for a minute.
I am so happy.
Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting with Josh Colle, former city councillor in the city of Toronto. What ward was it, Josh?
It was Eglinton Lawrence, so kind of if you can picture a part in Toronto where the Eglinton Crosstown in the south, near where I live, right up to the 401, around Yorkdale, and so two transportation corridors that are a lot quieter these days than certainly when I was last in office.
And I apologize for sneaking, but I snuck a view over your right shoulder, and it looks like you got a nice stained glass window. So I presume you're in an older home in Toronto right now.
Yeah, I'm lucky. We all kind of have our creature comforts that have been disrupted by this, and kind of as our worlds have shifted online. But I'm lucky. My family and I are kind of here in Midtown Toronto, and while probably getting a bit sick of each other, we're healthy. We've got a backyard, and I think we're pretty fortunate when you think about what's going on everywhere else. And so it will be exciting to be back out there. I think probably you're feeling that too, I'm sure. I know you like being out and about, but we're doing okay.
Yeah, I live in Mississauga. I've got a big house, big backyard. And you say you've got a backyard. I can't imagine some of the people in downtown Toronto in small condominiums that may have a little balcony. I've felt really bad about these restrictions on parks. And I know the parks have been open, but or at least they've been said they were open, but cordoned off the parking lots and roping off high parks so you can't go and crowd and see the apple blossoms or cherry blossoms. And
it's tough. Well, I know we have a lot of I have a lot of colleagues, younger ones on my team who are living that life that you described, right? And in a condo downtown, where it's tough, especially if you have a roommate. And so you imagine that if you're kind of in downtown Toronto or near Square One, and you're in your condo, and you kind of relied on the open spaces around you as the extension of your living space. It's difficult, and I think those are a lot of the ways we're going to have to rethink our cities, right? So beyond transit, how do we look at park space differently, and green spaces, and ones that maybe we took for granted or thought of as a luxury, you start to realize they're pretty integral parts. If you want to intensify, and we talk about transit-oriented development, and you think about what is happening around Mississauga, and the intensification in some areas, that only works if you have the amenities, and of course transit's one, and we'll talk lots about that this evening. But I think we're learning too that open spaces, green spaces, rec spaces are also a big part of that too.
And I wonder if this restriction on open up the parking lots of parks has really almost been an income disparity where some of these parks, if you've got if you can walk to it, if you live in a nice neighborhood, and or if you've only got your backyard, you're not impacted overly. But if you're in a condo and or if you're in a townhouse development and you've got to drive to a conservation area park and the parking lot's now closed,
I think so. I think a deeper analysis will have to be done on that, because I do think, I think of the ward I used to represent, and half of it is tenants, many of those in high-rise type of apartments, who really would have relied on some of the local parks and trails. It is difficult to tell that person that kind of tape up or lock down a walking path when others like us have the luxury of that backyard, right? So I think those are the types of things that will get, which is good. You're trying to look at silver linings coming out of this, that there'll be, I think, an earnest policy and political debate about how we kind of value those spaces and what their importance would be to many people.
Do you think this is potentially the end of high density living in condominiums, that people are going to want to go back to single family homes in suburbia?
It's a really good question. We've been doing a lot of work. We actually just did a survey of municipalities around transit-oriented development, and really the fact that it makes sense, right? You put people where transit is, especially higher order transit that costs a lot of money, and it's a good way to help pay for it. And cities are growing that way, and it makes a lot of sense. I think it will give some people pause, but at the same time, the one trend that I don't see changing is just such a huge number of people every year wanting to move to Ontario and to cities like Mississauga. And so, there is the reality of needing to put them somewhere. I do think, though, that there has to be, the same way we talked about, as you build transit infrastructure, we have to look at a mixed use development near transit that's quite dense a bit differently. Will the standards of green space have to increase? Will you the rooftop patios and common spaces and green spaces that maybe were luxuries, maybe they become essentials and mandatory. Because if you want to make, clearly we've seen where a virus like this can spread is where we are all closely interacting. And we love that about cities. We love that about cities that are well served by good public transit, like New York and Toronto and things like that. But I think it does reflect the need to, use this public health lens now as we develop communities.
So in the short term, what are you expecting? Everyone have to wear masks? Everyone?
So I think in the short term, there's going to be, and this is a good thing, standards on kind of worker protection, which is really important, right? All those bus and LRT and subway operators that are going to have standards put in place to make sure they're safe. And so that's probably more separation from frontline work and customers and each other, and shields and masks and things like that. I think there's going to be a kind of a sanitation and hygiene standard that our systems will have to be held to, that you'll notice the same way you notice shopping now. You've never seen so many people kind of mopping the floor at a grocery store. I think the same will be said for public transit, which again is a good thing. And I think there will be restrictions on those spaces, whether it be in a bus or on a station platform. And so in the short term, there will be that. The one thing I would say, though, is that all comes with a cost, a quite specific cost that has to be borne by a transit agency or a city that right now is really in a tough spot in terms of cash flow.
Well, if I think about the lineup outside of my local grocery store and how physical distancing has been put in place and how they're limiting the access to the grocery store, if you do that to my local GO train, there's going to be a lineup all the way to the 401.
Yeah, and so the one topic that I think is gaining a bit of attention is, so we all typically travel at the same times, right? The workday has long been kind of built around two peaks, and we build our infrastructure to serve those two peaks. In reality, if you've ever kind of been on that same GO train, if it runs midday or on your kind of bus that you might take, there's a lot of capacity. And so I think one of the tools that will have to be examined are ways by which we can spread out people's use of the system.
So I had one consultant come to one of our Transit Alliance dinners and say the most ludicrous thing is that we haven't learned differential pricing, that airplanes and movie theaters have differential pricing and our transit system doesn't. And in London, if you travel before 7, I think it is, and after 10, you pay 50% of what you pay for the peak.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We kind of weave back and forth with talking. We both mentioned grocery stores. You see how, for public safety reasons, a lot of policies have been implemented where certain times of day are reserved for seniors. Similarly, we've often talked about the cost of transit for older and lower income seniors. Could you look at incenting them to travel earlier or maybe later outside of the rush hour with pricing tools? And so you start to look at that for a public safety issue. And so could you say that seniors have a reduced fare or even less if you can get them out of the rush hour peaks? Students, do students have to travel? Have their travel and school day align with the workday? Could they start later? Lots of literature on that about how much capacity that could get you, and maybe even benefits to the students starting at my sleepy teenager starting the day later. But I think you're right. The only real way you can get that shift is pricing tools. You've got to price the cost of transit for the user differently if you want them to take it at a different time. And so that's always been a difficult conversation in certainly in Canada and North America, but I think it's one that will be back upon us because of these issues.
No, a lot of us have gotten used to working from home, and whether it's Zoom or Microsoft Works or FaceTime or just the old telephone, we're reasonably productive and functional. And as I mentioned on the break, I miss working at Bay and King. I miss the interactions. I miss the meetings, the convenience of going to see people. But the reality is, I don't need to be there all the time. Beirut, Lebanon, when they opened up, and it was last week that they implemented this, or maybe 2 weeks ago, they're only allowing people to go out half time. So depending on the last digit of your license plate, you're either allowed to go out on an odd day or an even day, whatever your license plate is corresponding with the odd or the even of the week. So they're cutting down their traffic by 50%. And that applies to cars and to transit and to whether you go to the office or not. So effectively working from home half time.
Yeah. No, I think that's gonna be part of this puzzle too, a piece of it. And I think of even a company like ours. We've got 10 floors in downtown Toronto and offices across the country and the world. As we see people return in say our offices in China, they're not returning the full complement. And so whether it be by your department or maybe the floor you work on or tied to the project specifically that you're working on, I suspect there will be, for the foreseeable future, kind of modified, kind of in-office schedules. And with that, I think that lessens the burden on public transit, right? So maybe the capacity problem isn't one immediately. I think the bigger, more immediate problem then becomes, if you were forecasting, revenue for public transit, to think that we'll be back anywhere near 80 or 90% ridership in the interim I think is probably not likely, for the exact reason you pointed out. We've learned we can do it. For safety and liability reasons, many companies will enforce it. So I think you're not going to get everyone just flood back to their offices. So that takes burden off public transit, but adds a financial strain.
Now, supposedly the numbers in China that has reopened are that transit ridership is 50% of what it was before COVID-19, but car purchases are going through the roof, and the traffic jams are outrageous because
Yeah.
people are choosing the safety of their own private car. You think
Yeah.
that's going to happen? If that does, that's going to clog the
Yeah.
Gardner Expressway and the 427 and the Don Valley Parkway in our
Yeah.
parking lots downtown.
I think it's a big issue, right? Because there'll be people who just don't have the comfort level of returning. And we've, again, I've seen that in some of the polling out there right now. I also think there are just some people who are in higher risk categories, and so one of the topics that I think needs to be, spoken about more is, for all the paratransit service that cities run, Mississauga or Peel, I guess, does it for Mississauga. Will that mean a different eligibility requirement? So typically it was a physical ailment or challenge, or that would get you access to say, Wheel-Trans or Trans Help or these types of mobility services. Maybe if you're more susceptible to infection, that will be reason that you can get your own trip through your transit agency. And so will there be kind of an increase in that type of service, and could that be delivered in an on-demand way with, partnering with taxi companies or the Ubers or the Lyfts of the world? So I think it's going to trigger a lot of these types of reflections and forced revisiting of how we deliver service, right? Because at the end of the day, we all agree public transit is essential service. We need people to get around to support the economy. We're going to need to do it in different ways. And so I think everything will have to be examined.
After 9/11, security at airports was dramatically increased to stop, obviously someone bringing a bomb aboard or a knife or a gun or something aboard a plane. And we spent unbelievable amounts of money to secure ourselves against that risk. Do you think we're going to have the same or similar situation here where we start, having, instead of metal detectors, temperature detectors or virus detectors or something like that at every entry point to a plane or to a bus or to a train?
I think you're going to see some of that. I mean, I actually just spoke to someone who's got a prototype ready to go, and it's portable, mobile, that can give you your temperature to within 0.2 degrees of what it is with a bunch of sensors. So airports seems to make sense. Public transit, a little harder to administer. What I think you might start to see, though, is, if you want to keep your workers safe, if you're running Mississauga Transit, maybe as everyone arrives to the garage that day, they would go through something like that to make sure that they're not at risk. And if they are, maybe they don't work that day. And so I think you're going to start to see technologies like that deployed. And there's, of course, a cost to it. Are we at the point of seeing one at every kind of My Way or TTC entrance? I don't think so, because it's just the logistics, but I think there will be those types of measures that will go kind of hand in hand with some of the PPE precautions we discussed, and some of the sanitary and hygiene issues too.
Well, in China, supposedly to get into office buildings, you've got to go through temperature checks. And in South Korea, they've got these apps that are
Yeah,
identifying you if you've got a high temperature and or if
yeah,
you have been infected and or if anyone in your house has been infected, and you've got to prove you're non-infected and not
yeah.
connected to someone infected before you're allowed to do stuff.
Before you're able to kind of congregate with a large number of people. It was interesting. I just saw recently some statistics about Taiwan. It's got a population around the size of Canada and has had very few cases and deaths. And part of what that they point to is the testing, right? And so one of the things, who knows when a vaccine comes, right? I don't know enough about that science, but from what you read, it could be weeks away or many years away. And so I think the reality is that it's going to be testing, testing, testing. And the more we're doing that, and every tool we can implement that helps us kind of advance testing, and then kind of separating people who might be at risk or separating people who might be sick is the way we get back closest to our normal, or kind of what our normal used to be like.
Testing, testing, testing. We keep on hearing that refrain over and over again. We're chatting with Josh Colle, former chair of the TTC. We're going to take a break for some messages and come right back. Stay with us. Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting tonight with Josh Colle, former city councillor, former chair of the Toronto Transit Commission, a gentleman that knows a lot about transit and infrastructure and city and urban issues. And now he's the Senior Vice President of infrastructure at Ernst & Young, a big consulting company here in Toronto and I guess around the world. But Josh, do you specialize in Toronto stuff, or are you working on stuff around the world?
I spent so much of my life on Toronto stuff, which I love. I love my hometown. It's been nice the last kind of year or so working in other places, and so lots of work kind of across Canada, a bit in the States, and so it gives you good perspective, and some of the issues that you thought were so uniquely, Toronto unique to Ontario, you start to realize are shared by other cities and systems, and it gives you some good perspective. And so, working with a lot of municipalities and transit agencies in both in Canada and a bit in the U.S. So it's been a very refreshing, and it's also given me lots of good perspective for back home.
Fantastic. And what have you learned? What have we done right? What have we done wrong?
So one thing I've learned is that we're pretty hard on ourselves, right? Like we kind of beat ourselves up for issues that, are frustrating as a resident. Like you want more transit built more quickly, and you want better kind of alignment of all orders of government. But you start to realize that's a challenge everywhere, right? And so I think what you start to learn is that when the conversations for places that do it well, there's certainly political will. There's a willingness to maybe think a bit differently and think outside of the box and not be so constrained by kind of that really deadly phrase of that's how we've always done it. But at the same time, I think when you start talking about the outcomes, like what do you actually want to achieve? You're not building a subway because you just want a subway. You're doing it so that you can, help people get to work and school and get people around and build your economy. And when you start to talk about outcomes and flesh that out, you start to realize that, those orders of government that were disagreeing and those maybe communities that were disagreeing, they actually agree on the fundamental things. And then that starts to give shape to how a project should maybe be built or planned, how a service can be better delivered. And then I think you're having more meaningful conversations. And so we're a bit tough on ourselves. We've actually got a lot on the go. But, the one thing we can't do, COVID or not, is kind of lose our ambition and lose our kind of a bit of our momentum that we have in this region where we're building, right? You can't afford to stop because some other jurisdictions will blow past us.
Well, I agree with that, but let me challenge you on the three levels of government all working together to get people to move. If I could for a second, I've been worried that every different politician comes forward with their own plan on a map, and the plans change so often by different reigns by different people that come in. We had what was it, Transit City and David Miller, and we had LRTs all over the place, and then we had buses all over the place, and then we had subways all over the place, and then we had the big move, and now we've got a one-stop Scarborough subway extension and this Ontario line that's come out of nowhere that no one ever heard about. And, people have been studying transit in the Greater Toronto Area for decades. We had this big move. We've had so many plans. And now the one that the governments are all supporting, it seems just because, I don't know, Doug Ford had such popularity or money or something like that. But now we've got this brand new Ontario line. What's going on?
I think the what we need to do is vote for someone whose policy on transit will be, I'm proposing 0 new projects. What I'm going to do is deliver what we've been talking about and what's on the books. When my old job as TTC chair, I should have kept them. I would get people submitting to me their transit maps. Do a line here, do a line there, right? It's kind of become a pastime of people in this region, right, who think they can draw a better map. And I think the reality is that is, well, really interesting and fun. It gets dangerous. And to your point, then you don't make that progress. And so I think we as voters need to reward the person who may not have a new line on a map. And we'll say, actually, our priority is to build the projects we've all committed to, or that we've all planned, or that we've all paid for. And that would be, I think, music to my ears, but my guess is that person won't get our votes.
So, great principle, but not the last election, but 2 elections ago, I think one of the reasons why John Tory got elected was because he came up with a plan that excited people.
Yeah, and so that's the challenge. I think now we as voters expect that, on day 3 of a campaign, if you're running for a mayor of a city or become a premier, or even nationally, people are going to say, okay, where's your transit plan? What new projects are you proposing? And I think if you, in a way, you said nothing, you might be kind of laughed off the stage. But we may need that. We may need that. If right now we were to commit ourselves to what's in the pipeline, we'd be pretty good. And what you need to get to is a point where you have some projects under construction, another set of projects that are in pre-construction, heavy development, going to kind of market, and other ones that are in planning. And as one opens up out of construction, everything moves up the pipeline and the new one comes in. And that has to become real rigor, and kind of you got to become regimented about that, and that there's clear criteria. And we kind of said at the beginning of this conversation, started talking about, well, now public health and wellness has got to be a criteria. That should be clear to everyone why a project gets into that pipeline, and you would know that it's next on the list, and when one's finished, it's going to move up. That's the way we have to. And to be honest, I don't think we should use jurisdictional roles as a crutch. Let's get over that, figure out what the province does, what the cities do, sign up for it, and let's get moving.
So this one-stop Scarborough subway, most of the experts, I think, have said it doesn't make any sense, but the politicians have always, particularly the politicians that are looking for votes from Scarborough, have always said it ends up having to be done. Do you agree with it?
So I think right now the current plan is to add additional stops under the kind of the current provincial government who's taking on that project. So my take on the Scarborough subway debate that seemed to rage forever is, you want to just get on with it. I think the challenge with the transit planning in Scarborough was, from my take at least, for anyone who's taken that SRT, while it's kind of in rough shape, part of the beauty of it is it had a dedicated corridor, right? Now it was elevated, and old trains is kind of this very novel technology that they pushed at the time. And maybe in retrospect, one that should have just been restored, right? Maybe 10 years ago, and we would have been in a better spot. It would have looked sleek and new. But I think for me, the struggle with light rail is that corridor runs through like heavy industry. There's no ridership. There's industrial lands that you can't develop by city policies and bylaws. And so I always found it strange that you would run this very kind of urban, street-centered, low-floor transit through, what's in essence a ditch through industrial Scarborough. And so to me, that was more why I turned my mind to looking at a subway option, is recognizing that there's no ridership potential in between. So for me, it was whether it's above ground, surface, subway, there would have to be some recognition that you'd either have to change that alignment if you wanted to run like typical light rail, because you just wouldn't have an interface with kind of public or development opportunity. So at this point, it looks like now the latest iteration with the transit deal between the City of Toronto and the province since I left is that there's going to be additional stops added to Scarborough. And so that becomes one of the 4 projects. It's an extension of the Eglinton Crosstown west to the airport. It is Yonge North, so going past Finch on Yonge Street on the existing Line 1. It is an extension of the Line 2, Bloor Danforth line, out to the town center, which has to be connected. There's no doubt about that. It's a huge growth center, but with more stops than what council had last settled on. And then the 4th one, which is kind of, I guess, the showpiece in terms of for the province, would be this Ontario line that would connect from the lake to the Science Center. So the interesting thing is the province has taken on ownership of all of those.
What do you think of this Ontario line?
So I think the Ontario line recognizes some of the challenges that the relief line was going to face, right? The relief line has been talked about for 100 years. One of its great challenges was it has to go under a river through one of the oldest parts of the city, deal with an expressway. And at that point, all you've done is connect, say, Pape Station to say King or Queen. So I think this tries to look at a less obtrusive and less costly way of dealing with those issues, and so that might be some elevated portions. I think the other benefit that it brings is that, like the transit city, some of it's actually a bit of a return to transit city. It connects communities that, I guess, priority neighborhoods we used to call them, in Flemington and Thorncliffe. And so as the line connects further, it starts to bring those communities closer to transit, closer to jobs, closer to downtown. So I think there are benefits to it. It is complicated. There's no doubt about it. The relief line was going to be complicated. I'm at the point now where you just really want to see work proceed. We need this transit built. Even if we anticipate lower ridership because of our kind of post-COVID world, this region continues to grow. They're essential projects, and so we have to just keep moving forward.
It's going to be different technology. It's not going to be a subway. Is that correct?
Yeah, they're looking at, from what I understand, different technology, and I think there's part of that is for cost reasons. Part of it is for maybe to make it for cost for building, but also operating. And so I think it would be different technology. And then so that at that point, what you want to do, and part of the priority becomes to make sure you interface as seamlessly as possible with the existing legacy subway. And so that for someone who then wants to jump on another mode of transit is able to do that. And I know that that's part of the work, but yeah, I believe they're looking at a different technology that, I think would be subway technology, but maybe not the same track gauge, train type, those kinds of things that we've typically come to know in this region.
Was the Pearson Union Express the right decision?
Yes, rail connection to the airport was completely the right decision. The one thing that's interesting about it, though, now is it sounds like they're reviewing that to see if it should be more of a commuter service as opposed to a kind of a direct, airport-only service. From what I've heard, the ridership on that is incredibly high, and a lot of that is because of the opportunity for airport workers to use it at a discounted rate. And I think that's had people recognize that that's a huge constituency of potential riders. Similarly, with some kind of extension of the crosstown along Eglinton, west towards the airport, there are just tens of thousands of people who work there, not just even at the airport specifically, that need to get out there. And I think right now the Up Express service is not ideal for them. In terms of pricing and location. And so I think you'll have to have multiple connections to the airport. And I know they've obviously got their very ambitious plans of a regional transit hub out there that would start to envision, the BRTs and LRTs coming from, Mississauga in the west, light rail, heavy rail, and bus coming from, all points east and around, converging at some kind of transit hub to serve that part of the city.
And what do you think of that? Does it make sense?
There needs to be another hub, right? Like Union Station at a certain point can only take so much, right? Because right now, like most cities in North America,
something like 98% of the people that use Go Transit on a daily basis go through Union Station.
Yeah. Now, part of that's they have no other choice. It all goes to Union, and that's typically how all of our big cities and cities have been, have evolved. And so, at some point, there will have to be like we're building a network, right? And that's what you want to build towards. And so, you want a network, but there will have to be a recognition that Union's capacity is finite. As much as there's so much really interesting and complicated work going on to add to that capacity. And the workflows, this, like the workflows have changed too. Like the drive to Mississauga in the morning is not what it used to be, 10 years ago and vice versa. I used to work at Pearson Airport, and I always assumed that I'd be going against the flow and have this easy, commute back and forth, but it's busy, right? And so recognizing that, you have to build.
There's many people that drive into Mississauga as drive out of Mississauga on a daily basis. Anyway, we're chatting with Josh Colle, former chair of the TTC, now a infrastructure consultant with Ernst & Young. We're going to take a final break for messages and be right back with you. Stay with us.
In Mississauga.
Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting tonight with Josh Colle. He's a Senior Vice President in Infrastructure with Ernst & Young, and he is a former city councillor in the city of Toronto, and he's former chair of the TTC, the Toronto Transit Commission, and a guy that I've always respected in regards to his knowledge of transit and urban issues. Josh, you've been involved in city issues, particularly transit, but lots of other city issues. What's your vision for Toronto? If you had to stand up and sort of give this is my vision for Toronto in the next decade, what would be some of the things that you would be identifying?
I think for me, it's time for Toronto to be more ambitious. I think sometimes we are our own worst enemy and we hold ourselves back. And if you think about what we have here, you've got in Toronto, but even the region, right? We've got a collection of people who have chosen this as their home. Most people have come here. And so we've got the most talented, energetic, innovative people that we need to harness. And so to harness that and to make this city what it could be, which I think could be the greatest on the planet, we have to support that. And that means being innovative. It means being entrepreneurial. It means government helping in those efforts, but at the same time, not being a burden. And I know that sounds a bit cliched, but I think we have to enable that. And to me, like obviously, a lot of my heart's in and around transit. I see transit as just one of those tools, right? How do you unlock the potential in the people who have chosen this as their home? And I think that's why you build it. You don't build it for the sake of it or because you want to move widgets or you love trains. You do it because you've got this amazing kind of convergence of people and ideas and talent. And let's best leverage that to make a really strong economy that makes people able to afford to live here, want to live here. And I think that's when you start to see a city that continues to grow in a healthy way.
Is there a big catalyst to that development that you see? I was disappointed that it was recently announced that Sidewalks is leaving, and there were people that were pro and con that.
Yeah.
But the idea that Google, Alphabet would be putting so much money into developing our waterfront, it was going to be a game changer. Positive or negative, it was going to be a game changer. Yeah. Are there other game changers for Toronto that you look to?
So I share in your kind of assessment of that one. I think that would have been a game changer, and the kind of conversations they were having about how cities have got to change. I think though that's where the game changing lies, right? We can't just organize ourselves and use our spaces the same way we always have. We've had this great debate about park space. Well, let's be bold, right? Let's create more. Let's ask people what they want and need and invest in it now. And so I think that type of innovative thinking and those kind of opportunities have to be leveraged. And you're not going to do it alone, right? There is going to need to be partnership with other orders of government, but also with the private sector. And that's not a scary thing, or shouldn't be a scary thing, and shouldn't be kind of a dirty word. I think there's a recognition there, and we have to figure out what we do well. But again, we talked about this earlier. What do people want? What do the people want from their city? And we have to have that conversation and start with that outcome, and then design something to meet it. Don't do things for the sake of it. Like we need to focus on the outcomes, and those outcomes should be people focused. That's why we build transit. That's why we build cities. It's about people, not just about stuff and concrete and widgets. Let's build it for people.
So there was a editorial or a column in the Globe and Mail that was talking about we should be opening up a lot of our lanes for restaurants to extend patios and do it in a socially distant manner. Is there an argument that says we need to have a lot more public space and particularly road space given over to commercial interests?
I think it's something we have to look at. And I think one thing that we need to, not be quite so polite and Canadian about is just trying things. Try it. You know what I mean? Like what's the worst that can happen? It doesn't work, and then you stop doing it. And so I think there's a cautiousness to government, and city government should not be that, right? The city level is where you should be able to innovate and take some risks, and obviously ones that where you're right, everyone's safety is taken care of. But I think there's great value in, like, that's what cities are, right? They're these amazing urban experiments, right? Of people coming together with all these amazing ideas and ambitions. So let's build on that and try things. And so if that's one idea that someone's had right now that they think might address a need that's out there, then let's try it. And again, the worst thing that can happen is, you know what, you learned it didn't work, track it, measure it, make sure you know whether it worked or not and what your desired outcome is, and let's try things. We shouldn't be so afraid to kind of break a little bit of glass, but let's innovate.
What about wider than Toronto or the GTA? Are you a supporter of high-speed rail or hyperloops to Montreal, or any any pet project that you think would be a game changer for the?
So the one thing I think will be a game changer, and I think this is going to be the transit and the railroads of another generation, is 5G and broadband and connectivity. And so one thing that remote working and isolation has taught us is that not all Canadians have equal access to those opportunities. And I even know, my family has a place just north of Ottawa, an hour north of the nation's capital. No one could work from home there because of the connectivity. Not an option. No one could go to school remotely. And so, yes, there's the kind of pandemic response necessity to have that. But I think if we really want to start to stitch together all of these communities, give ourselves a competitive advantage, then that's, I think, the big game changer that we need to turn our minds to. I think cities across the country and towns have a really great opportunity to play in that space. And to think it's probably coming anyways. Maybe there's an opportunity for cities to lead it, maybe to realize some of the revenue potential from it. But I think that's when it starts to knit together communities in a way that we talk about, but maybe we're not there yet. And you think about what that could do for some of our First Nations communities, some of our remote and northern ones. It could be pretty exciting. And if maybe we would look back on that, and our our grandkids' history books would look back on that the way we talk about the railways of a different generation.
What about you personally? Is politics done for you, or are we going to see your name on the ballot again?
No plans right now, and that sounds like a political answer. I love the gig, but it's a demanding one on your family. And I have a young family, and I think at one point I woke up and all of a sudden I had teenagers that hadn't seen me around a lot for about 10 years. And so for me right now, that's the time. And what I'm enjoying now at EY is I love helping cities and working on city and urban issues. I get to do that now in a bunch of places. So I'm really pleased with that right now. I'll never say never, but no plans.
Well, Josh Colle, thank you so much for joining us today on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I really appreciate it. As some of you may know, I'm chairman of an organization, a civic advocacy organization called Transit Alliance. Thursday afternoon, we're going to have the new CEO for Metrolinx, Go Transit, to our session, Phil Verster. And afterwards, Josh is going to hopefully join us in a little bit of a panel discussion. So if you're at all interested in that, let me know, and I'll connect you in. Anyway, Josh, thank you so much. And
thank you, Brian.
And,
keep up the good work.
To knocking on doors for you sometime.
No, I don't know about that. Thanks, Brian.
Have a good evening, everybody. That's the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 every night, Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock. Thanks. Good night.